Hello, I'm Philip Marris. I'm the CEO of Marris Consulting. I've been implementing the theory of constraints, usually combined with Lean, for over 30 years, over 200 times throughout the world in all sorts of industries, designing and making cars, trains, aeroplanes, rockets, hamburgers, and many other things. So we've seen in a previous video the problems you will encounter if you use the traditional approaches of project management. We're now going to do 3 videos that present the 3 pillars of critical chain project management. This one about planning, the next one about execution, and the final one about improvement. This is an extract of the one-day training courses that we give regularly in-house here in our office or at client locations all over the world, and that we've delivered to over 1,200 people, over 200 organizations over the past few years. To understand how you plan a project, we're going to take this simple case and step by step we're going to implement critical chain. So presented in the form of a traditional Gantt chart, we have a project here, a simple project where a certain number of resources, Peter, Cecilia, Amelia, Macy, are going to realize various tasks. So for instance, Peter starts with an 8-day task here and then has a 4-day task, and then Simon does a 4-day task, and all the interdependencies are presented in this traditional way here. And again, in a perfectly traditional manner, the first thing you probably ask yourself is, where is the critical path? The critical path is the sum of task durations, which when summed gives the longest duration, and therefore the project duration may be. And this is presented in red here. Okay, and that is the close cousin, but something quite different from the critical chain. This is the critical path. Before going further, let's just point out that this isn't quite a normal planning. It's already a pretty good planning, what we call a dynamic schedule. That's to say, it's obeyed a certain number of rules, which you can see detailed in other videos, which is, for instance, that we don't plan to have people working part-time on a particular task. We don't say, 20% of Peter and 30% and so forth. It's all full-time. Obviously, the sequences of interdependencies are identified, and furthermore, there are no fixed dates anywhere in the schedule, hence the name dynamic. We haven't put any fixed gates or tried to pin anything down in time, right? It's free to float, it's dynamic. Okay, so that's already a pretty good schedule, and in fact what I've just said we encourage you to use even if you're not using critical chain in standard scheduling. So what do we do? Well, the first thing to underline, of course, is that presented in this way, the critical path does not take into account capacities, and therefore it's not giving you a realistic duration. And to understand what that realistic duration could be, you need to level that schedule, and most project management software enables to do that. You press on a button and it takes into account the capacities of the resources, and so for instance here it's decided that Peter will do first this task, then that task, then that task. Okay, and obviously when you do that you get a longer schedule, since it's had to stretch things out to take into account whether people were available or not. Okay, we'll come back to this, but it's true that the critical chain is very close to critical path, but it takes into account the availability of resources. Not only, but it does do that. Okay, so let's start with the first step. The first step is removing the local safeties that are integrated in each task. If you haven't done so, I encourage you to have a look at the previous video, the first video in the series, which details exactly what the madness is of local safeties. Okay, and so we're going to reduce the durations of tasks. And I want to make this very clear because it's led to a lot of criticism of critical chain in various places. And there are 2 very different ways of reducing the durations of tasks. Okay, and it's true that many books, even Eli Goldratt himself, describe one way of getting rid of local safeties as dividing all the task durations by 2, right? A top-down managerial decision, I will divide all the times by 2. It's not unreasonable because empirically it's been shown that that's a pretty good way of doing it. That's to say that safety is often about half the task durations. So it's not completely absurd. But if you do that, as is quite rightly pointed out by critics of the critical chain, it's going to break any kind of possible buy-in by all the different actors of the system, right? So what we prefer is to get to the same result. The task durations will be reduced significantly, probably by about 2. But we do this by a buy-in. The buy-in is quite simple. We teach the various people who are going to give those times what is the critical chain approach. And we usually use either a half-day or one-day session, of which this is an extract, right? And we explain the whole thing. And then we come back to them and ask them, okay, you had this 10-day duration for this task. We now want you, following the training you've had, to give us your focused duration. Okay? This is something very different from what the times they were giving before. What is a focused duration? The focused duration assumes that the person will be working in basically perfect conditions. That's to say that when they start their task, they will have the full kit of information, whatever they need to do. And furthermore, when they start their work, they will be able to concentrate on that work and not be interrupted by anything else. Okay? So it's asking them in perfect conditions, how long would it take you? And finally, very importantly, it is not any kind of engagement. That's to say, the first question we ask them is, what do you think your average time would be? Let's just say, give us a duration in which there is a 50% probability that you will take more time than that estimate. Okay? And if you take more time than that estimate, you will not be criticized. You will see why later. Okay? So the same task, 10 days, we come back to them and ask for a focus duration, and often they give you, of their own volition, a much, much shorter task at time. Okay? But it's not, we're comparing apples and whatever. It's not the same question, right? To be more precise, we ask them for 2 times. We ask them for the focus duration as I just described it, which is the most probable focus duration, and we ask them for a pessimistic duration, again focused. You have perfect conditions, but if you find the work is a lot more complicated than you expected, what's your worst case scenario, or what's your 80% probability of where you think that 80% of the time you'll be able to do it in that duration. Okay. Why do we ask that second question? It's because we need to know not only the average duration or the probable duration of the task, but we need to understand the variability, as you'll see later on how we take that into account, right? Because the world of projects, as you know, is full of variabilities and Murphy and so forth. Okay, so we are going to reduce the task durations. Okay, you can do it however you want. Indeed, you could just impose top-down, divide by 2, or you could do it our way. We've been doing it for many years that way, and we've never had any kind of failure. Indeed, in many cases, we've found that people of their own volition will volunteer times that are less than half of what they used to do. Okay? And to be clear, this is very different from one task to another, from one situation to another, right? Don't look for a blanket rule. Let's take a situation of new product development in pharmaceuticals. At one stage, you're going to have to prove that your product is stable. And to do that, you're going to put it in a fridge for 12 months and then take it out and look and see if it's okay. Fine. That is a legal requirement. Nothing can change that. It's going to be 12 months, right? So the focus duration is not going to be any shorter, and the pessimistic duration is not going to be any longer, right? It's 12 months, a fixed duration, right? And you have to accept that in projects some things are like that, right? But take something else like, I don't know, you're designing a mechanical part for a product, okay? The variability could be quite significant, even being perfectly professional, even working in perfect conditions. The part arrives, you have to design that, okay, oh, that looks like the part I did 3 months ago. You get out the old drawing, you modify it according to the new specifications of the new part you're making, and you get it right first time, and it went really quickly, okay? But faced with the same part to be done, you might find that finally the specifications, the tolerances, the weight or whatever, makes it quite a difficult part to design, and it will take you a lot longer than you expected, right? So there's a huge variability. Maybe the time to do that drawing will be between 2 hours and 50 hours. Okay, so you have to understand that in projects there's the questions of average durations and the questions of variability, and we need to start modeling them. The models will never be perfect, but we need something. Okay, so that's what we do. And in teaching that and explaining that, we just come back to fairly obvious stuff like, you know, if you look at the time, a day's work by somebody, they will be actually working and doing their value-added work for a proportion of their time, but often a very small proportion. In the durations they've been given, there used to be security margins. They're going to be heavily disturbed maybe by multitasking between this particular project and another. It depends on the environment. They're going to have meetings, as you know, to explain why they're late and where they are and where they're going. And they're going to have to waste time going to find deliverables that are incomplete, and lots of other stuff. Anyway, as I say, if you explain to everybody that it's not any kind of individual fault, but it's a collective situation that has led to local securities, you can get individual task safeties eliminated from the schedule. That's the first step. The second step is to level the resources, as we saw. That's very simple. If it had been planned that the same resource should do two tasks at once, well, you sequence them so that you do one thing after the other. Okay? And this is just a fundamental thing about critical chain. It takes into account the capacities of resources. So, in this particular example, just to summarize, if we apply the first two steps simultaneously, this is what it looked like before, right? Peter had to do this and it took that much time, and after we remove the safeties, it's a lot shorter, okay? And Peter was doing several things at once, but now he's no longer doing several things at once, and it's been sequenced, okay? And the sum of those two things depends on projects and stuff, but in this case, as you can see, means that the planning is shorter than it used to be, right? Because you did shorten all the times by 2, that's made it shorter. It's true then you've leveled, which will make it longer. Between what you've lost and what you've gained, you get something that is shorter. So those are the first two steps. Let's have a look at the third. The third one is to identify where the critical chain is, okay? And in fact, it's there, but until you've learned the critical chain where you probably won't be able to see it. What is the critical chain? The critical chain is the longest path of a project, and it takes into account logical links and resource dependencies, right? So it's, in fact, here, there's a dependency of a resource, and then there's dependencies of tasks, okay? It's the combination of those two things, okay? And it's important to understand that, because if you're learning about critical chain, and you say you want to do critical chain, you'd better be able to answer the question, what is critical chain? And the limited, restricted technical definition of the critical chain is there, okay? But as I'm sure you're now realizing, the critical chain approach is a lot wider than that and goes way beyond this limited definition. But that is, technically speaking, the definition of the critical chain, okay? So, where is the critical chain? Here it is. It's in red, okay? And it's fundamental. It is that sequence that is going to determine the duration of a project, right? It is not the critical path, it's the critical chain, okay? And I remind you, critical chain is part of the theory of constraints. You can also say that it is the constraint of your project. If you win a day on that particular sequence, your project will be a day shorter. If you lose a week going through that sequence, your whole project will be a week later, okay? It is not dependent on the non-critical, okay? So that's the critical chain, and that's good. But what's wrong with what we have here? Would you plan a project like that? You shouldn't, because these are focused durations, right? There's a 50% probability that they're going to take longer than that for each individual task, okay? So doing it this way, you'd be more or less guaranteed not to finish on time, okay? So what we have to do now is first get rid of put aside the non-critical tasks, okay? Non-critical ones in blue, okay, here. This whole bunch of tasks, right, could be in fact planned up here as early as possible, or down here as late as possible, right? We'll see in a second what is recommended, but there's no obvious answer to that question, whether you're doing them at the beginning or at the end. I'll give you two options. If it involves a lot of investment, spending money and stuff, you probably want to do them as late as possible. If you are working in an uncertain environment with specifications that could change and stuff, you want to do it as late as possible. But for a rather bad reason, if you're using earned value and you were getting paid according to the time you'd spent, you might want to move this stuff forward. Anyway, there's no obvious answer to where you would put those things. Let's get to the final step, step 5, and that is to insert the buffers, which no doubt you've heard of because it's one of the things, the first things people learn about when learning about critical chain. We've just said that that sequence, okay, is risky because it's based on the average times, okay? And earlier on, we've calculated the level of variability of each of these different tasks, okay? So what we do now is we calculate, in fact, what overall protection would be needed down here to absorb the probable variability in the individual task of the critical chain, right? That's why we were asking for probable times and pessimistic times, okay? And one of the nice things about critical chain is you don't have to sum all the variabilities here, okay? Because you're taking into account this whole sequence, and you can have the compensated collective variability here. And I won't go into the formulas with square roots and stuff, but this buffer, because it's global, will be a lot less than the sum of the individual safeties that you had in the system previously. Okay. Again, without going into the formulas, please note that this buffer is fairly big. Okay. And for instance, one of the possible rules to identify its size is to take into account the size of the critical chain, divide it by 2 and say that's the size of the buffer, okay, or said in another way, 1/3 of the duration of your project is the buffer, okay. That's a simplified explanation because of course some projects have more variability than others. Let's say that if you present a project under critical chain that has less than a 20% buffer, I'd be worried that maybe you hadn't modeled the variabilities correctly, but it's possible. So that here is the project buffer, the most well-known buffer, and we will see in the next video about execution how important that is. But it's not the only buffer. We have feeding buffers here. What are those feeding buffers for? These feeding buffers are designed to ensure that the non-critical stays non-critical, okay? Because if we put this stuff right at the end here as late as possible, if they had a problem, they would become late and they would stop the critical chain, okay? So what we do is exactly in the same way. We look at the sequence here, we work out what the variability is, and we install a buffer, a feeding buffer when it comes into the critical chain, and we plan to have everything arriving for the critical chain with a little bit earlier according to these buffers, okay? In this way we can ensure that the thing is stable, and that will be the critical part, and this sort of thing will never become critical, okay? We ensure that the non-critical stays non-critical. So we have the system here with buffers, and that's it, okay? But what is that? That is something of huge value, because it is a planning that is high performance. It's high performance because these durations are very short, okay? It's very realistic because it hasn't assumed, you know, I have 3 Peters. It's taken into account the availability of resources, okay, which a lot of people in project environments are not doing anymore in any kind of serious, detailed way. And finally, it's accepted that the world in which we're executing the projects is full of Murphy and problems, and nothing is certain, and therefore it's got huge protections to absorb all the problems you're going to have with execution. Okay, so the probability of doing the project quickly but finishing on time or even before the given due date is very significant. Okay, and that's planning according to critical chain, a very efficient planning which is very robust. Let's now talk about portfolio management. Most of the implementations of critical change throughout the world these days are in fact not on individual projects, but there are portfolios of 10, 100, 1,000 simultaneous projects work in an organization going through the same resources. Okay, so how does that work? Well, the first remark will sound kind of simplistic, but it's important. To ensure that your portfolio of projects is controllable and things turn out okay, it's a good idea if each of the individual projects is properly scheduled with a robust schedule. Okay, so that's quite simply one of the first key advantages of critical change project management. It's full of healthy projects, right? Which is going to make it easy to manage. Okay, so you do use critical change on the project, and then you put all these projects together, and you have a portfolio. What do you do in that portfolio? Well, this is part of the theory of constraints. You accept that, in fact, in your organization, if we model it like this, as a series of resources doing various tasks. Okay, you've got people, for instance, in product development doing proof of concept up here, and at the end you've got people doing testing, for instance. Okay, and that your projects are going to flow through all the different departments or resources. Okay, the theory of constraints says that you have not managed, this is impossible, to distribute the work equitably, and so somewhere in that system there is a constraint. Okay, there's a resource which has overload compared to everybody else, and so the first step is to identify that capacity constraint. You can look at our videos specifically on that subject about identifying constraints in project environments. It can be difficult because of lack of good, rigorous, pertinent data, and for many other reasons. And indeed, it might not even exist as such, and in which case you need to choose within the system where the control point is. Okay, so step one, either find the constraint or decide at what point in the system you're going to control the entire portfolio. And step two is to stagger the launch of projects according to that constraint or control point. Okay, so if we've decided that the constraint is here, to avoid what we have in this diagram of the system being clogged up with lots and lots of projects in the queue, okay, we're going to make sure that when we launch a project, it's coherent with the work that's in the system and the capacity of that resource. And in that way, we ensure that there is continuous high-speed flow of projects going through the entire system. Okay, so that's a very short version of critical change project management for portfolios, and there are videos that go into more detail about that subject too, because obviously portfolios are very different from one kind of business to another, for instance. So that's a very quick summary of how you plan projects in a critical chain way, and the next video in the series is about how you execute. It's probably a little simplistic, my apologies. If you want to understand it fully, we recommend that, for instance, you come to our one-day course that this is a short extract of. And let's conclude with 2 points. One is just a little warning in case you get caught out by somebody on the subject. And if you don't understand me, go back through the video to make sure you've understood. If you don't change anything else in a project description, a critical chain is longer than a critical path. Okay? And yet, critical chain claims to be able to do projects faster. How come? How is that possible? Well, don't forget, that's simply because the durations have been significantly reduced, and the safeties have been taken out of the tasks and put into a project buffer. And if you do all that together, that's how you can take into account the availability of resources and yet have project schedules that are a lot faster and yet more robust. Okay, just a little warning in case you get caught out on that one. Finally, another point which you need to understand when you implement these ideas. This was a very simple case, right? We were just a few resources and just one project. It's obviously going to be quite time consuming to do this in your environment, And so, yes, critical chain requires you to spend more time initially planning a project before you launch it. Okay, and that can be difficult to convince people to do that, because people have basically given up on high quality scheduling of projects because they think that it's impossible or useless to plan a project in any kind of detail, because the ink won't even be dry on the planning before it's completely irrelevant. Okay, so people are diving into projects without proper planning, and critical chain says no. If you really want to be efficient, take the time to properly plan. Okay, so that's important. So that's a brief overview of how you plan a project the critical chain way. In the next video, we'll see how you execute such projects. Thank you.